First, Mr. O'Brien and the very large team that's here as well. I will allow you to answer the questions, and I do understand the difference between, as the previous speaker did, the difference between Section 38 and 39 funding. So hopefully when you know that, it will avoid then having to repeat that, and we want to get the best use of the time that we have. I do find your opening statement extraordinary, and I have to say that the answers to the questions that have been put so far are also extraordinary in terms of, first of all, the sequence of events that led to the internal audit in the first place. Second of all, the value for money issue in relation to money that was spent by your organisation, and you're the Chief Accounting Officer for the HSE in respect of Console, and also the checks and balances and controls and potential failings within the HSE. So you've said that you don't accept that there was failings within the HSE. As far as you're concerned, the failings were all on Console side, and we know that there was failings in respect of Console. We have an internal audit report that has 60 findings, and in the report on page 34 it ranks the findings high, medium or low. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Underneath the rankings it says where recommendations may have systemic, national or regional implications. The rankings are shown as high, medium or low. All of the findings were ranked high. And it goes on to say that systemic is defined as where particular audit findings of a serious nature may, in the opinion of the auditors, be replicated elsewhere in the HSE. And it goes on to say that all of the findings in the audit have a high rating, and many have national implications for the HSE. So the internal audit that was commissioned by your own organisation says that the systemic failures potentially could be replicated elsewhere in the HSE. It's acknowledging there was systemic failures. It says that it has national implications for the HSE, although you say something else and you don't accept that. And for many people, this could be seen as the tip of the iceberg in respect of a lack of controls. Now, you cannot sit there with all seriousness when you are dealing with a report that has 60 findings into an organisation that's partly funded by your organisation. You signed the cheques, you're the Chief Accounting Officer, there's clear failings, both ways, in my view, where all of those failings are of a high ranking, all show systemic problems and failures within the organisation and the relationship of that organisation with the HSE, which you're responsible for, and say that there was no failings on the part of your organisation. So in terms of page 34 and the rankings and what it says in terms of the internal audit, can you first of all comment on that?
Well, these are the standard rankings used in all of our internal audit reports. The aim of internal audit obviously is to provide both remedial recommendations and also to identify what lessons might be generalisable and what can be gained from this internal audit process that could influence our practice more generally. So there are some recommendations there which are specific and are fed now into the annual compliance programme, which is undertaken by our compliance office. So in every audit, whatever it might be, however large or however small, there are always findings which lead to the question, do we need to look to see what in our systems can be improved in light of the knowledge that we now have? And that's what's called systemic or systematic.
This is not an ordinary audit. Its findings are extraordinary. In your experience, have you seen an internal audit before that had 60 findings, all categorised as high, and also a report from your own auditors which says that many of them have national implications for the HSE? Now, I'm sure you're aware, Mr. O'Brien, that auditors are very careful about the language that they use. So they don't use words lightly. So when they say that this has national implications for your organisation, that's serious. They have not put that in there lightly. And it would seem to me you don't grasp that reality. You cannot just say that all of the failings were on the side of Console, and we acknowledge that, and we will possibly at some point deal with those as well. Our job here is to ensure that there was proper controls and safeguards and checks and balances in place in respect of taxpayers' money and money coming from your organisation to Console. The report and the findings of the audit is littered with failures. But it seems to me you're not prepared to accept even the internal audit's view, not my view, the internal audit's view, that this report has national implications for your organisation.
Yeah, I think I already said in my first response to your question that the recommendations do have national implications. So there's a difference between were things done incorrectly in the past and can they be done better in the future. The focus of internal audit reports is to discern what lessons might be generalisable, as in systemic. And as I mentioned earlier, these will be fed in and have been fed in to the work of our National Compliance Office to ensure that we further strengthen our relationship with entities. That's a different thing with respect. We're talking about learnings. The Chairman asked us earlier about learnings. Learnings are not necessarily the result of failings. They are learnings.
Well, that's your interpretation, but people might put a different interpretation as to what the auditors meant. You're putting a more positive slant on what they meant by national implications. But as I said, I don't think with all seriousness, when you consider the gravity of the report, and you have to accept that this is very highly unusual in its findings in terms of every single finding being ranked as high. And the extraordinary failures, I think that doesn't come across in respect of your report. Can I just get to a number of other issues if I can? I'll start with the sequence of events, because it seems to me that the clock starts in 2013 in respect of your view as to what the trigger was for the internal audit, maybe even 2014, because you talk about the National Office for Suicide Prevention, concerns that they had in relation to the helpline funding, and that led to the internal audit report. But you have to go back further than that in terms of the clock starting, because concerns were raised, as was said earlier, in 2006, and there was an exchange between you and the previous speaker on that, and we've heard what you had to say. We also had an RTE report which says that in 2009 an official in the National Office for Suicide Prevention wrote a memo highlighting deficiencies in Console's governance and accounting, saying that the 2004 expenditure did not add up, the 2006 accounts had wrong membership of the Console board, the 2007 accounts were not signed off on by the chairperson, and questions needed to be asked of the $145,000 spent in professional fees charged over years. In 2011, further concerns were raised with the Department of Health. And we also know that concerns were raised by a former parliamentary assistant to Minister James Riley, and subsequently to an official in the HSE or the department as well. So the clock, with respect, Mr O'Brien, goes back much further than the 2013 start, which you would have us believe that concerns were first brought to the HSE's attention in respect of this. The reality is that there was many flags raised and the flags were missed, and there was a 9-year gap between when the flags were first raised and when the internal audit report commenced. Would it be fair to say that, in your view?
Well, it's certainly true that there's a 9-year gap between the earliest date you've mentioned and the start of the internal audit. But I think it is useful to the committee if we provide further information on the nature of the different concerns that were raised at different times and why they would not have triggered the process that this latest issue triggered. So my colleague Anne O'Connor, who's the National Director of Mental Health, can provide that information.
I think, Deputy, in terms of the concerns that have been raised, we've addressed in terms of 2006 concerns. The letter is in, and the concerns related to particularly to clinical issues within the organisation. The key concern that related to, you could argue, more governance-related matters was the concern raised in 2009, which was internal to the National Office, where a staff member there actually raised concerns. At that time, Console were met by the then Director of the National Office. As Jerry has previously said, everybody has changed in the National Office since that time. But they were met then, they were brought in. They were then signed up to a formal performance management process. The concerns that were raised, again at that time the funding to Console was in the region of 250. It increased slightly in 2008, 2009 because they were developing standards. But the funding was substantially the same. and they were advised that they could not get additional funding from the HSE. They were brought in for regular meetings. The concerns were addressed at that time to the satisfaction of the National Office. The requests that they made for additional funding between 2009 and 2013 were refused. I think it's also important to say that the funding that had been provided to NOS pre-2013 really had them in the space of being a grant aid agreement rather than a service arrangement. So the arrangement differs once you get past a certain threshold of funding. So it's a different type of governance process, it's a different structure. Their funding in the overall scheme of things was relatively low compared to many other organisations. So it didn't trigger a significant audit, it didn't trigger significant scrutiny because the funding was very low. The critical point here was 2013 when their funding increased, as we've discussed earlier, on the basis of the helpline. That then moved the organisation into a different category, if you like. It moved it into a service arrangement where there was a different governance. At the time of the increased funding, the organisation were advised that they would be signed up to intensive scrutiny on the basis of their funding, and that happened. So the concerns, I think it's fair to say that in 2009, they were met on a regular basis. And I suppose a limit was put on their funding. Their funding wasn't increased and they were advised. But the concerns were addressed at that time by the organisation. And again, as the DG has said, in terms of at that time, the decisions that were made. But,
sorry, with respect, what I was trying to get to, and I just want to move on to another set of issues that relate to this issue as well, and direct them to Mr. O'Brien. Thanks for the response, Ms. O'Connor. If it was just the flags that were raised by individuals in 2006 and 9 and 11, in terms of red flags, then that would be one issue. But the problem is that when you then look at other failings within the organisation that really should have triggered alarm bells, it actually adds to the intrigue as to why the HSE took so long to respond. Because we now know that there was sets of accounts, different sets of accounts, that Console had, depending on the organisation that was looking for them. That was the annual financial statement. And different arms of the state were given different sets of annual financial statements for the same year. We also know that there was unsigned service level agreements. So we had clear failings in relation to documentation. That also should have added to the concern within the organisation. So it wasn't just that there was flags raised by individuals. There was also issues in relation to documentation that you are responsible for overseeing. There's also issues in relation to who are directors and not directors, salaries, all sorts of issues that really should have been red flags for the HSE as well, and it would seem that they were all missed. Before you comment on that, can I ask you a specific question in relation to service level agreements? How many service level agreements were in place, and at what different stages between the HSE and different arms of the HSE? So was potentially even different service level agreements depending on the arm of the HSE, and can we get copies of those? And also, what audited documentation was Console obliged to furnish to your organisation? And not just external audit reports, but also secondary documentation like management letters. Were those external audit reports furnished to your office, your organisation, for each of the years that they should have been? And was the accompanying management letter, that is also a requirement, and you're the Chief Accounting Officer, so you will know that, were they submitted to your organisation for each year?
You've asked a series of questions there, and I'll try not to miss any of them as we reply. First of all, there was no unsigned service arrangement with Console until 2015. So that's an issue that arose during the course of the internal audit process, as opposed to one of the triggers. You've referenced the duplicate, or rather not duplicate accounts, the differentiated accounts, which were in fact one of the major triggers for the internal audit, and it was the National Office for Suicide Prevention that identified that. In relation to the receipt of audit AFSs and management letters, I'm going to ask Jerry to answer that question.
Each year, in terms of the National Office approach to our funded agencies, including Console, we begin the year by asking people to set out their business case for the year ahead, the quantum of service they're to provide, their staffing structures, etc. And we go through a process of agreeing funding and agreeing service quantum. for the year ahead through that process. We do.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt it, but I want to ask a very straight question, and it's really just information I'm looking for, and it's
Sure.
either yes or no. Did you receive the external audited accounts that you would have been obliged to receive each and every year
Yes.
from Console, and did you receive the accompanying management letter for each and every year?
I need clarity on the management letter. That's a letter from the board.
Well, maybe the CNHE might clarify what that is.
An accompanying letter from the auditors setting out management actions.
No, we received, not for every year, we received a...
That's extraordinary. That's a requirement.
We received the audited accounts for...
No, but that's not the question I asked. I'm talking about the management letter certifies whether there's problems with the accounts or not. If you did not receive that management letter, that is also a flag that should have been...
So I think there may be a terminology issue.
From the independent auditor to the board of Console.
The accepted term is management letter, but maybe the CNHE could clarify.
It's between a certification and a management letter.
I understand that.
And the certificate, a bit like the CNAG certificates, would have matters of emphasis or qualification where required. A management letter is a letter to the management which gives them indications of areas for improvement. Those are two separate things that the CNAG might want to clarify.
No, I think that explanation is correct. It would be where, in the course of audit, the external auditor identifies any weaknesses in controls that are supposed to be in place in the organisation. The standard practice is not a qualification of the accounts. It's not if you like, a modification of the audit opinion, but it does provide an opportunity for the board of an organisation to ensure that the control system that they have put in place is working. It would be an auditor would be obliged to send that if they identified.
And would it be unusual
matters.
if that wasn't? Then would it be? Should it be sent every year?
It could be a situation where there are no control weaknesses identified. In that situation, I suppose good practice would be that you would inform the board that no such weaknesses were identified in the course of the audit for 2013, 2014.
Okay, can I move to my last question? I think my time is coming up, and that's in relation to the value for money. Because I first of all don't doubt that Console provided quality services, and we're all conscious that there are people who worked for the organisation and provided a top-class service to people, and I don't want to in any way take away from that. But I do want to focus in on the call centres, and finding 52 says that Console reduced the number of its helplines from 6 to 2 between 2012 and 2014. Console confirmed internal audit that the cost of running its two helplines in 2014 was €346,652, of which the HSE provided €294,000. During the audit, internal audit was not provided with documentation to support these costings. So here was the HSE, and you're the accounting officer. You signed the chequebook, giving an organisation €294,000, and it cannot be proved. We cannot find documentation to support the costings. So we don't know, and you don't know, whether or not that money was used for the purposes of which it was intended. So if that's the case, you cannot then say you got value for money. In response then to that, in terms of the report, Console respond to it themselves, and it says that with regard to internal audits, comment that information was not provided to support cost allocations for the Console 24/7 helpline. Console confirms that all support information was included in the general accounts framework provided to the internal audit for the years 2012, 13, 14. No other information was requested by internal audit for the helpline. They go on to say that no HSE request has ever been made to Console management to allocate a specific helpline code in Console's general ledger. The auditors respond by saying that the issue is not about allocating a specific helpline code in Console's general ledger. The issue is that Console did not provide any supporting documentation during or after the audit to show how it determined these costs as being allocated to helpline costs. So I can't see, on the basis of that, Mr. O'Brien, how you can, again with accuracy, say that you got value for money. You can, of course, say that the service itself was a quality service, but you cannot say you got value for money if you don't have supporting documentation to support the costs. And I put it to you that you are the Chief Accounting Officer. I put it to you again, because it's my last question, that this internal report that we have been given, that we're discussing, says that there is national implications for the HSE. I really don't think that you grasp these implications at all. I think there's an element of downplaying this. When I said earlier, I pointed to the findings where it says that systemic means that this could be replicated elsewhere in the HSE. I don't think anybody can say with certainty that it's not replicated elsewhere across the HSE. I don't think people are going to be comforted by anything that's been said. I think because of what's in this report, I think people are going to be very, very concerned that the true reality of the situation has not been grasped by the Director General of the organisation. And I find that personally extraordinary. But you might come back on the specific questions of the helpline and the fact that my assertion that given that there's no documentation to support the costs, how can you then say that you got value for money?
Final response from Mr. O'Brien before we go on to Deputy McSharry.
Thank you, Chair. In relation to my view and the organisation's view on value for money, it's grounded on what it would typically cost to provide helpline services of this type, services that we know were provided, benchmarked against other activities. It was good value for money in the sense that we were getting a service which we now know from information provided to us by the interim CEO was costing Console more to provide than we were paying, and indeed it will cost us more to provide the alternative service than we were paying to Console. That is a reasonable basis upon which to say that we got value for money. And as you've said yourself, there has never been a question mark around the quality of that service in recent times. In 2006, there were question marks raised about the quality of the counselling supervision for that type of headline, which the organisation at that time addressed by bringing in a separate person as its CEO who remained there for 2 years. And that's one of the reasons why those issues were dealt with satisfactorily at that time. This is a slightly different matter, though, to the broader issues within Console which have been uncovered by the internal audit, which go far beyond the resources which were provided by the HSE, but because of the relatively chaotic nature of the way matters were handled in that organisation, which led to their inability even to demonstrate to us at the time that they were spending more money providing services to us than we were giving them, it was impossible for the internal audit function not to audit everything in the organisation, which is what's given rise to all of the information that's in the internal audit report.